Hello everyone. In this video, we will go through 15 sample questions and answer them in detail to help you prepare for the DP-200 exam. In case you would like to purchase the entire set of 165 practice questions, use the link in the description below along with the discount code. Please comment if you would like me to do the sample test for any other Azure certification, and do subscribe, share and like the video. So let's get started. A company has an Azure SQL database in their Azure subscription. The automatic tuning settings are configured as shown below. The question is, would the setting of create index be on for the database? Before answering questions like these, it is important to play around with Azure services for choosing the right option. Since the question is asking about the settings at a database level, let's go to a database and navigate to the automatic tuning settings. All the settings for a database can be inherited from the server or from Azure defaults. So the Azure defaults are on for force plan and create index and off for drop index. In the question, as the server level settings are inherited, it must have inherited from Azure defaults, and since the database settings are also inherited, it could have inherited from either server or Azure defaults, and both their settings are same in this case, so the answer should be on for create index at the database level. So the answer is yes. Now, effective from March 2020, the new Azure defaults are enabled for force plan and disabled for create index and drop index. So in that case, the answer would be no, but right now the correct answer is yes. You need to create a new Azure Databricks cluster. This cluster would connect to Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 by using Azure Active Directory integration. Which of the following advanced option would you enable? Well, to answer this, you need to play around with the creation of Databricks cluster in Azure. So let's go through the process. So in Azure Databricks service, launch the workspace and create a new cluster. If you come down in the advanced settings, it is mentioned that you can enable credential pass-through to access data lake storage from Databricks cluster. This will allow users to authenticate to data lake storage from Databricks cluster using the same Azure Active Directory identity used to log into Azure Databricks. So the right answer is credential pass-through. You have JSON files stored in an Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 account. The JSON file contains the first and last name of customers. You need to use Azure Databricks to copy the data in the JSON files to an Azure data warehouse. A new column must be created which concatenates the first and last name values. You have the following components in place in Azure: a destination table in the SQL data warehouse, an Azure Blob storage account and a container, and a service principal. Which of the following you would perform to transfer data to the Azure SQL Data Warehouse table? Choose 5 answers from the options given below. Well, to connect to Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 account, we first need to mount the file system to Databricks file system using service principal. So first will be option D, and then read the file from Data Lake Storage into a data frame in Databricks. So option F. Next, we need to transform the data in the data frame to combine the first name and last name values. So option C. And to upload the transformed data frame as a table into Azure SQL Data Warehouse, you use the SQL Data Warehouse connector for Azure Databricks. This connector uses Azure Blob storage as a temporary storage to upload data between Databricks and Data Warehouse. So the next option will be to specify a temporary folder in storage account to stage the data. So option G. And finally, we write the results to a table in SQL Data Warehouse. You have an Azure SQL database, WizLab DB. The database contains a table WizLab customer. This table has a column customer ID of the type varchar22. You have to implement masking for customer ID with the first 2 characters and the last 4 characters are exposed, and all other characters are masked. You decide to implement data masking and use a random number function to mask. Would this fulfill the requirement? Let's go to the dynamic data masking settings in Azure SQL Database to understand whether random number mask will fulfill the requirement. For any column in a table, you can choose several mask formats. So there is the default value which will mask a value based on its data type. Credit card and email can also be used to mask credit card and email fields respectively. The random mask given in the answer will generate a random value between these two values, and that value will mask the original value. But for the requirement in the question, we need to expose the first two and the last four characters and mask the remaining characters in between, which will be rightly satisfied by the custom string format mask. Here, you need to enter the number of characters exposed upfront and the number of characters exposed at the last, and the remaining characters in between are masked. So custom string format will rightly solve the problem, and the correct answer will be no. A company wants to use Azure Databricks service. There is a need to create clusters based on the following configuration. For cluster A, it needs to be configured to terminate automatically after 120 minutes. For cluster B, an environment needs to be created for each notebook. And for cluster C, a group of data engineers will share the same cluster. Which of the following cluster types would you set for cluster B? To understand this, let's view how the clusters are created in Azure. There are just two cluster modes available, either high concurrency or standard, so that pretty much eliminates all the other options. And the standard clusters are configured to terminate automatically after 120 minutes, and they are recommended for single users. The high concurrency clusters are for multiple users, and so they have fault isolation built in, which means these clusters create an environment for each notebook, effectively isolating them from one another. So the correct answer is option D. A team currently manages Azure HD Insight Cluster, and they spend a lot of time on creating and destroying clusters. They want to implement a solution that can be used to deploy Azure HD Insight clusters with minimal effort. Which of the following can they implement for this requirement? Well, with Azure Resource Manager templates, you can automate the repeated deployments of any Azure resource. The others are incorrect, as Azure Databricks is a separate Spark-based analytics platform, and load balancer is used to distribute traffic to the backend VMs. And Azure SQL Data Warehouse, as the name indicates, is the data warehousing solution in Azure. A company needs to configure a synchronization of data between their on-premises Microsoft SQL Server database and Azure SQL database. The synchronization process must be able to perform both the initial and bidirectional synchronization. Which of the following is the right answer? Well, if the question talks about synchronization, then the answer is most likely Azure Data Sync, which is a service built on Azure SQL Database to synchronize data bidirectionally across multiple SQL databases and SQL Server instances. Data Migration Assistant is incorrect, as it is only used to access database for the migration process. And the others, from their names, is evident that they will not be used for the synchronization process. We will come back to this question after going over another question which is more detailed than this. You need to fulfill the below requirement of the case study. Applications with tiers 6 through 8 must ensure that unexpected resource storage usage is immediately reported to IT data engineers. Which of the following would you implement for this requirement? Since the requirement is for monitoring storage, it will be either option C or D, and we do not have much information regarding whether we need to monitor a database or an elastic pool. But this question is also a part of the case study, and in the case study, it is mentioned that the databases from tier 6 to tier 8 use elastic pool. So the answer will be option D, which is to monitor storage percentage for the elastic pool. You have to access Azure Blob storage from Azure Databricks using secrets stored in a key vault. You already have the storage account, the Blob container, and Azure Key Vault in place. You decide to implement the following steps. Add the secret to the Key Vault, create a Databricks workspace and add the access keys, and access the Blob container from Azure Databricks. Would these steps fulfill the requirement? Let's go over the scenario described here. We have the storage account, and to let Databricks access the storage account, we copy the access keys, and within Azure Key Vault, we create the secret and store the storage account access keys as a secret value. Now we need to refer to this secret in Azure Key Vault from Azure Databricks. For that, in Databricks, we need to create a secret scope by going over this URL. So when you create a secret scope in Databricks, you can leverage all the secrets in the Key Vault and not just any single secret. And refer to the Azure Key Vault from the secret scope by specifying the DNS name and the resource ID information of the Key Vault, which you can get from Azure Key Vault properties. The first point is fine, which is adding secret to the Key Vault, but the second point says create a Databricks workspace and add the access keys, which is incorrect. We add secret scope to the Databricks workspace as just described and not the access keys, so the answer will be no. A company is planning on creating an Azure SQL database to support a mission-critical application. The application needs to be highly available and not have any performance degradation during maintenance windows. Which of the following technologies can be used to implement this solution? Choose 3 answers from the options given below. Well, if you need to know the availability guarantees for SQL database, then take a look at the SLA information. Here, Azure SQL Database, Business Critical and Premium tiers, which are configured as zone redundant deployments, have an availability guarantee of 99.995%, which is in fact the highest SLA guarantee. So when you are creating Azure SQL database, there are plenty of options to choose from, but if you select basic or standard, they do not have the zone redundant option. So if you select premium and enable zone redundancy, you get the highest availability. Also, you can choose business critical with zone redundancy. So the correct options will be premium service tier and zone redundant configuration. Since the question asks for 3 options, you can also choose always on availability groups if you run SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machine. A company has an Azure SQL data warehouse. They want to use Polybase to retrieve data from an Azure Blob storage account and ingest into the Azure SQL data warehouse. The files are stored in Parquet format. The data needs to be loaded into a table called vislab_sales. Which of the following actions need to be performed to implement this requirement? Choose 4 answers from the options given below. Okay, the steps to load data from Azure Blob storage to Azure SQL data warehouse is given in this document, so let's go through them. All these operations are defined in the destination SQL data warehouse with the help of tsql commands. These steps identify the source to the SQL data warehouse. First, create a master key which is required to encrypt the Azure storage account credentials. Second, create a database scoped credential to define the identity of Azure storage account. Third, create external data source where you define the location of the data source along with the credentials created in the previous step. Next, create external file format which specifies the actual layout of the data in Blob storage. Next, create external tables which defines the column names and data types, and this binds to the location and format of Azure Blob storage files. And finally, load the data. So in the list of options, let's select master key, creating external data source, external file formats, external table, and finally loading the data into a staging table, which is actually a good practice in production environment rather than directly loading the data in the final table. Before moving forward, we will go to the question 8, which is very similar to this question. In this question as well, we need to migrate data from Azure Blob storage to SQL Data Warehouse, and we need to choose 4 options to do that. First, we need to provision a SQL Data Warehouse. We don't connect to the Azure Blob storage with SSMS, but rather connect to Azure SQL Data Warehouse, so option E. Then create external tables to reference Azure Blob storage account, and finally use T-SQL statements to load the data. This question assumes that you already have Blob data in place, so option C is incorrect. And option F is incorrect as well, as you build external tables in SSMS rather than from Azure portal. A company wants to create an in-memory batch processing solution. They want to provision an Azure HD Insight cluster for the batch processing solution. You need to complete the below PowerShell snippet for implementing this solution. So we only need to answer what goes into area 1. This question is very easy to answer just with a little knowledge and by eliminating the wrong choices. Option C and option D don't look like they are PowerShell commands, so you can easily ignore them. The options cluster size in nodes, OS type and cluster name indicate that new Azure HD Insight cluster will go to area 3. The only option left is option A, which is new AZ storage container, which creates a blob container in a storage account that will be the default data store for cluster logs and other output. Even if you have not used a PowerShell command, this question is easier to answer if you have just tried creating a cluster in Azure portal where you would specify all the options to create a cluster. You have to deploy resources on Azure HD Insight for a batch processing job. The batch processing must run daily and must scale to minimize cost. You also should be able to monitor the cluster performance. You need to decide on a tool that will monitor the clusters and provide information on suggestions on how to scale. You decide to download the Azure HD Insight cluster logs by using Azure PowerShell. Would this fulfill the requirement? Well, Azure HD Insight cluster logs will not give you the ability to decide on how to scale the cluster. You need to use Azure HD Insight cluster management solutions, which will provide cluster-specific data from each HD Insight cluster, which will give details regarding to scaling. These additional data can be added to Azure Monitor logs. And coming to the final question, a company has a storage account named Wizlab Store 2020. They want to ensure that they can recover a blob object if it was deleted in the last 10 days. Which of the following would they implement for this requirement? Well, firewalls and virtual networks is clearly not the right answer. CORS is an HTTP feature to allow web application to access resources from another domain. And access keys are used to access the storage account. The correct answer is soft delete, which enabled lets you recover the data whenever a blob is mistakenly deleted. The blob can be recovered for a certain number of days, which can be configured. Once done, let's submit the test and you can verify your performance from the result. Also, you get the performance report domain-wise, so you can analyze the questions for any particular domain and you will see all the questions, their correct answers and the explanation for each question and also links to the Microsoft documentation in case you would like to learn the concept in depth. So if you are serious about clearing DP-200 exam, check the description below for the link to entire practice test. Roughly there are about 165 questions that cover the entire length and breadth of all the objectives in the exam. Also, please comment below If you would like me to do these sample tests for any other Azure certification, and do subscribe, share and like the video. Thank you.